everyone, and welcome back to the penultimate episode of our summer story time here on the Kids Life Catch-Up. I am, as always, Bill, the kids pastor here at LifePoint, and last week, as we began our 3-lesson look together at the Old Testament book of Esther, we learned all about how the short-tempered King Xerxes had his wife, Queen Vashti, permanently banished from his presence after she'd refused to present herself before him and his guests at a grand banquet that he'd been holding to flaunt his wealth and power. Now, without a queen at his side, King Xerxes and his servants conducted a search throughout all of the provinces of the empire to find the most beautiful young women to bring to the imperial capital of Susa, so that the king could choose from amongst them a new wife for himself. After a year of beauty treatments and instruction by the head servant placed in charge over them, this group of potential candidates was presented to the king for his approval, and out of all of them, Xerxes fell head over heels in love most of all with a young woman from right there in Susa by the name of Esther. Immediately, he placed the queen's crown upon her head, promoted her cousin Mordecai to serve at the palace gate, and then threw yet another lavish banquet to celebrate the selection of his new wife. Little did King Xerxes realize, however, that his bride had a secret, one that she'd been instructed by her cousin to keep for her own safety. Esther was, in fact, a Jew, one of God's people from the nation of Israel who had been exiled from their homeland by the Babylonians decades before. Mordecai had feared that should any of Israel's enemies also living within the empire ever find out about who Esther truly was, or where she came from, it would prove disastrous for her. A very timely precaution given all that's about to happen as we move forward with our story in the next few chapters. With all of that out of the way then, let's turn together now to Esther chapter 2 verse 21 through chapter 3 verse 15, where we begin our story this week with not only a brief adventure for Mordecai, as he continues in his service to the king at the palace gate, but also the introduction of the last of our 4-person cast of characters, an Amalekite servant of King Xerxes by the name of Haman, who, spoiler alert, his full description in the story is a bit of a tongue twister, so you have my apologies if I stumble a little bit. But anyway, Esther chapter 2 verse 21 through chapter 3 verse 15. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, 2 of the king's servants, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the 2 men were executed. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but he still refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence, the lots were called Purim, to determine the best day and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7th, nearly a year later. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There is an entire race of people scattered throughout all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit." So on April 17th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors of their respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all the Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would then be given to those who killed them. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa fell into confusion. Now, at first glance, Haman's sudden and volatile reaction to Mordecai not only failing to show him the proper respect, but more importantly, being a Jew seems rather extreme and out of the blue, doesn't it? I mean, yes, Haman is one of the top officials for King, I'm going to have my soldiers whip a river because I'm angry Xerxes. But even then, having an entire race of people wiped off the face of the earth just because one man at a gate didn't bow down to him seems just a tad excessive. However, as you begin to dig a bit deeper behind the scenes of this story, a few details between Haman and Mordecai's families begin to come to light, which can help us to understand just a little bit better why these two men are treating each other the way that they are. In our reading last week, when Mordecai was first introduced, he was described as being from the Israelite tribe of Benjamin, and a descendant of two men named Kish and Shimei. Though these might sound like random names to us, they were actually close family members of yet another important Bible character that we learned about just a few lessons ago when we looked at the story of David and Goliath, King Saul. What that means then is that more than likely Mordecai and King Saul were distant relatives, several hundred years and many generations apart. But what about Haman though? How does he tie into all of this? Well, during his introduction in our reading today, Haman was described as an Agagite, a descendant of a man by the name of King Agag, ancient ruler of the Amalekite people, a people who were the neighbors of the Israelites, renowned for their sin against the Lord. As it so happened, King Saul, at one point during his reign, was sent by the Lord to destroy these very same Amalekites, ruled at that time by King Agag, as punishment for all of the terrible things that they had done, which helps provide some much-needed answers as to what's going on between Haman and Mordecai and what we're reading about in Esther. Whereas Mordecai's ancestors had once tried to wipe out Haman's ancestor as a part of the Lord's judgment for their disobedience to him, now Haman was going to wipe out the Jews as punishment for Mordecai's disobedience to him. With news of Haman's government-supported masterstroke of revenge now having spread throughout the entirety of the empire, and the Jewish people having been thrown into turmoil and fear over their impending destruction in 1 year's time, let's turn together now to Esther, chapter 4, verses 1 through 17, to find out what happens next. When Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning amongst the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and servants came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's servants who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials, and even the people in the provinces, know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for over 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther: "Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arrive from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die." So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So here, in this last section of the story, we find probably my 2 favorite verses in the entire book of Esther, those being verses 13 and 14, which we'll read again real quick, but this time from the Message translation. "Don't think that just because you live in the king's house, you're the one Jew who will get out of this alive. If you persist in staying silent at a time like this, help and deliverance will arrive for the Jews from someplace else, but you and your family will be wiped out. Who knows? Maybe you were made queen for just such a time as this." The reason I love these verses so much actually ties back into what we were talking about at the end of our lesson last week, about the importance of such seemingly unimportant events in the grand scheme of the story of the Bible. At this point in Esther's story, no one had any idea that in just a few short years, Haman would enact a grand plan to try and eradicate his people's most hated enemies, the Jews. And yet, despite the sudden arrival of this major challenge for God's people out of the seeming blue, and the great sadness and despair that quickly overwhelmed them, the Lord had already been at work to provide them with a Moses for their generation, someone who could speak up on their behalf to the king and serve as the means through which the Lord could provide safety and protection for his people, Queen Esther. At that time, of course, neither Esther, Mordecai, nor any of the other Jews would have had any idea of how absolutely important or necessary it was for their survival for her to come into such a high-ranking position. But God knew. Of even more importance, though, and going a little bit farther beyond what we were talking about last week, is the fact that despite God having positioned Esther to be the person he would use to save the Jews, despite him having positioned her to be that person, his plans wouldn't have been handicapped or ruined if she hadn't taken that courageous step forward that she needed to in order to obey him. No, God's promises to his people and the plans that he'd been laying since the beginning of creation to save mankind from their sins were beyond the power and choices of a mere human being to derail. If he was set on something taking place and had guaranteed that it would happen, then there's nothing in the entire universe that could stop it. It was already as good as done. For as much as God had wanted to use Esther in this moment in history to save his people, if she had chosen to do what was easy for her rather than being willing to sacrifice her own safety for the sake of her people, then he would have used whatever miracles he needed to, called whatever people would have followed his lead, proclaimed whatever he needed to be said through his prophets, or done whatever other steps were necessary to ensure that the Jews escaped harm's way and could see firsthand that he was faithful and true to his promises to them. As the Lord himself declared when one of Israel's enemies sought to cause trouble for them, thousands of years before this, in Numbers chapter 23, verse 19. God is not a man, so he does not lie. He is not human, so he does not change his mind. Has he ever spoken and failed to act? Has he ever promised and not carried it through? If God has told his people that he's going to do something, then he will make sure that it gets done, one way or another. Thankfully for the Jews and for Esther herself, however, despite her own fear, and the very real possibility of death if King Xerxes was not pleased with her for coming to see him without permission, she still obeyed God's call on her life and sent out the request to her people to fast and pray for her over the course of the next 3 days so that she might receive the Lord's blessing and favor for the trial that she was about to embark on. As to the specifics of what happened when Esther made her courageous stand before the king and what exactly God would do to save his people from this extremely dangerous situation that they found themselves in as a result of Haman's evil schemes, we'll have to wait for our final lesson in our summer story time next week to find out more. Until then, however, Let's pray together. Dear Lord, I thank you for your love for us, for your power, that you are a promise-making God, dear Lord, that you care for us, that as we are faithful and obedient to you, as you have called us, you would do anything and everything within your power, dear Lord, to help us to press on and to do what you have called us to do, dear Lord. I thank you for always being with us, for comforting us and giving us peace, for walking beside us in whatever life throws our way, dear Lord. Thank you that not only you are a promise-making God, but that you are a promise-keeping God, dear Lord, and that you are always with us, dear Lord. I just thank you that in these days and in these times when there is so much stress and uncertainty and turmoil all around us in our land, dear Lord, that you can give us peace, that you can give us rest, that you can give us comfort, that you can help us to be bridge builders, and that you can help us as your servants, as we follow and obey you, to be agents of good in a land where there is certainly not enough good, dear Lord. So just continue to be with us this week and all that we go through. Guide us and use us now for your glory and for the work of continuing to spread the good news about Jesus wherever we go. And we just pray all of this now, and we thank you, dear Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, everyone. Moving on to this week's prayer focus for families. Thank God for his love, his faithfulness, and his promises to us, that he would do whatever it takes to remain true to his word. Thank God for the freedom that he gives us to make choices in our lives, and for his willingness to forgive us and give us a fresh start when we make mistakes. And ask God to help us as we face the challenges that come into our lives with grace, courage, and the knowledge that he's always with us every step of the way. And for our family discussion questions, why should we follow God's instructions Why should we follow God's instructions and trust him for his timing and what we're dealing with in life, as opposed to always wanting to do things our way? Read Esther 4:13 through 14. What do these verses say about why God allowed Esther to be queen? What do they say about what would have happened if Esther didn't speak up? What would have happened, or wouldn't have happened, if the Jewish people would have been wiped out during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire? According to Mordecai's word, would God have allowed that to happen? Why do you think Esther fasted and prayed for 3 days before going to see the king? Are there any challenging situations that you're going through right now that you should be going to God about in prayer? And have you ever found yourself led into a situation by the Lord where you were able to help someone else because you were there? Or have you ever been in a challenging situation yourself and other people who'd come into your life were able to be a blessing to you? What happened in either situation? And as for our additional reading this week, I don't have any, if just because I'm going to encourage each and every one of you to sit down and look over the last 4 chapters of the book of Esther that we've studied over the last 2 weeks before we move on to the end of the story next week. And with all of that being said, then, my friends, that wraps up the second to last episode of not only Summer Storytime but also the Kids Life Catch-Up as well. These videos won't be ending, but they might be changing in title in the next few weeks, so stay... Oh, goodness. This is what happens when your throat gets too dry. So, as I was saying, our videos won't be going away, but they might be changing names after Summer Storytime is over, so stay tuned for more news on that. But until next time, my friends, I am again Bill. Thank you for once more joining us here on the Kids Life Catch-Up Summer Storytime. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay well. I hope your week at school goes well, whether you're at home or in the building. And take care of yourselves and each other. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.